Universidad de Cornell. Es profesora titular de la cátedra Martha N. and John C. Moser de Biosistemática y Biodiversidad de Artrópodos en el Departamento de Ecología y Biología Evolutiva de la Universidad de Cornell. Es directora y curadora científica de la colección de insectos de la Universidad de Cornell, con un acervo de más de 7 millones de especímenes, y sus estudios los ha hecho en licenciatura y maestría en San Francisco State University, su doctorado en Biología Evolutiva en la Universidad de Harvard, y bueno, obtuvo el Miller Fellow at the University of California en Berkeley, y ha tenido distinciones en el 2021 como miembro de la Sociedad Real de Entomología, y en el 2020 como miembro de la Sociedad Entomológica de Estados Unidos. El día de hoy tenemos el gusto de tenerla con nosotros en una charla con estudiantes y académicos, con todos nosotros. Y es una charla de género, y el tema es Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, an everyone issue. Así que, bueno, sean todos muy bienvenidos y muchísimas gracias, Corey. Gracias. Thank you very much to stay here. We are very glad.
Great, thank you again for having me here. Today, we're going to shift gears. I'm not going to talk at all about the research I do. I'm going to talk about some of the, I call it activism that I do. I'm Corey Moreau, and I use she, her pronouns. I want to start by saying pronouns are incredibly important. They are not somebody's preferred pronouns, they are someone's pronouns. So it's important for you to know what your colleagues' pronouns are and what your students' pronouns are. All right, so first let's start by talking about what are diverse communities and why is it that we see that some individuals are underrepresented, especially in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right? We know that those are fields that, historically have been very dominated by men, and often men of one identity. So one of the things we know is that for other people that have wanted to join this field, we know it's not because they have no ability, and it's not because they don't have desire. We know that in many situations, other identities are underpaid compared to their white male colleagues. And we know that something called imposter syndrome, or the fear that they don't belong, can actually impact their ability to excel. And lastly, there's an analogy of the leaky pipeline that's often used, and I will talk further about the strengths and the weaknesses of that analogy. What we know is we're not going to fix these issues unless, one, people who are underrepresented stand up and insist that they have equal opportunities and access and resources. But on top of it, it can't stop there. People who have overrepresented identities in those groups need to do the work to help reach behind and lift up individuals so they can also excel. So what I hope that I'm going to convince you all today is that it's each and every person's responsibility, no matter what your identity is, to make sure that we make it the academy and science an inclusive and welcoming place for everyone. So what is diversity, equity, inclusion? In the United States, DEI gets thrown around a lot. They're letters, but I think it's important to really think about what the definition of each of those are. For diversity, it's the representation of all of our varied identities and differences, both as individuals and collectively as a group, right? So sometimes when you're talking about diversity, I might be talking about myself, where I sit in the diversity of a group. But sometimes I might be saying, well, we as a group, what is our diversity compared to another group? And so both of those are important. Equity ensures fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and fairness and access to information and resources for all. And I want to take a moment there and I want to pause, because people often think that equality and equity are the same thing, and they are not. Right? Equality says, oh, we should just treat everybody the same, ignoring that historically there have been reasons why some people have been excluded from opportunities. Equity is saying, okay, we recognize that everyone's coming from a different starting place, and we're going to make sure they have what they need to excel so that everyone can excel at the same rate. And lastly, we have inclusion. And inclusion is really this opportunity to make sure that everyone feels they have a belonging in that environment, and that they get to contribute equally, and that their voices are heard equally. One thing I think I often see is people think that if you fix one, you fix them all. So you might have some kind of, quota you're trying to say, well, we want to reach gender parity. We want 50% women and 50% men, ignoring non-binary people, which is already problematic. But you might just say, we're trying to reach that. Well, that's not enough, right? We have to do the other two pieces of work. We need to make sure that everyone feels that their voices are equally valued, and we're recognizing not everyone comes from the same starting place. We have to give them the resources to excel. The other thing that really has huge implications in this work is that every single individual on the planet has what we call unconscious, or really they're called implicit biases. And these are really the attitudes or stereotypes often shaped by the culture in which you were born and raised, that affects our understandings, our actions, and our decisions in a really unconscious manner. We know that they're activated involuntarily, right? So, when you have implicit bias, it's not that you are mean to be expressing these things. It's just that it's the culture in which you were raised. We know that it's not necessarily your intention or that you're doing it in an aware way. We know that they're robust and pervasive. And in fact, everyone is susceptible to them, even people we think that should be completely unbiased, judges, scientists. They've even been observed in small children, right? Because small children are already raised in a culture in which they're seeing things, they're modeling things. They may be letting those biases creep in. If you think you're immune, which I guarantee you not a single person in this room, including myself, is immune, I would actually recommend you should take some of the biases tests that are provided by Harvard. It's at implicit.harvard.edu. They have a whole suite of them. What's really great is they have a whole suite of them related just to science. And what's interesting is it's this little test where you sit with fingers on two buttons, and they're going to show you two words, and then you have to hit which one goes with it. And you can't think. If you go slow, the test is wrong. You have to just go quickly. And I guarantee you there's ones against like whether women should be in STEM, whether you have biases against certain ethnic groups. There's a lot in there. So I would encourage you all to do them. I love this quote by Carolyn Finney. She gave a keynote at the National SOCNAS conference where she said, bias is not the same as prejudice, and it's not the same as racism, but they're close cousins, right? So even though they're not invoked in the same way they can harm people can be the same. So in the United States, we have a lot of matrices by which we sort of measure whether you're considered an underrepresented minority. We often refer to them as a URM. And these are essentially people that have been historically excluded or marginalized from a particular sector of society. In this talk, we're really talking about within STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. They're defined as a group whose percentage, right, of the population is lower than the percentage of the overall population. So let's imagine we're talking about women. Women in the world are probably close to 50%. So in STEM, they should just be 50%. There you go. We know that. And if they're not, then there's something going on. Well, we know that women are not represented at 50% across all STEM fields in the whole world. We also know that that the underrepresentation and overrepresentation of certain groups is very field and study specific. We all know corners of science where it's very female biased. We know very corners of science where it might be very whatever biased, right? So you have to take into account which group you're talking about. In the United States, this is how we often define URMs in STEM. In our case, it's Black or African Americans. Within Asians, it's only Filipinos, Hmong, and Vietnamese, Hispanic and Latinx, Native Americans and Native Alaskans, Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, 2 or more races when they're from the list above, and in STEM, it often includes women. Now, for Mexico, it's going to be a different list, probably highly similar, but you might have different nuances. They can also be underrepresented in things like gender expression, sexual orientation, religions, and disabilities. And I think pretty much across the entire academy, disabilities is always a component of our communities that are underrepresented. So I told you before that we often talk about a leaky pipeline. Now, the reason that this analogy is so nice is it's so easy to understand. So what we're talking about here is the percentage of women versus men, again, unfortunately ignoring non-binary individuals, as they sort of flow through their career trajectory within the academy. And the idea that what makes it so nice is with women, we can say, well, they should be near 50%, right? That's what the population is. But you can adjust it depending on which group you're talking about. If we were talking in the United States about Black and African Americans, we might say, well, they should be about 13%, right? So we can adjust this accordingly. But in this case, we can say, okay, at the undergrad level, we see that it pretty much represents the population of the United States at about 50%. And at each point within their career trajectories, we're losing individuals, right? So by the time we get to things like full professors, they're making up a small percentage of who's actually at the table. Now, this is nice because it's easy to understand, but where this analogy falls down is it makes it seem like it's a passive process. Like, I don't know why they just fell out. But what we know is it's actually more like a sieve or a strain. That there are reasons that women are being excluded at every step, or other underrepresented identities, right? And it's often death by 1,000 cuts. It's the fact that we have, microaggressions occurring. We have opportunities that are not available. We know that the old boys network, like, oh, I'll nominate you for that if you nominate me for that, and we never get to be part of the conversation, right? So we have to think about what are those actual active processes that are causing this effect. This is something I think is really hard for individuals, and it's super important. Know your privilege. It's so much easier to list all the ways that you don't have privilege. I'm a first-generation college student. My parents didn't go to college. I grew up extremely poor. That's how I want to enter the conversation, so that people know I can relate to you. But it turns out that doesn't do anybody any good. I need to know my privilege, and I have a lot of privilege. Let's look at some of these examples. Actually, I'm going to take a moment. I forgot I'm going to do this, and actually ask you to reflect on what are your privileges, not what are I'm a woman in science, right? Gosh, wow, how did I make it this far? Not that. Think about all the things that you have that are privilege. All right, we're going to walk through mine. I'm a Caucasian white. In science, that means I have a lot of opportunity that's not afforded to others. I'm able-bodied. I don't have to worry about whether I can get up and down these stairs, right? I don't have to worry about whether the way I learn isn't the way that it's presented in a classroom. I'm cis, right? I'm not trans. I don't have to worry about whether my physical body is in harm's way as I walk into a bathroom. I'm heterosexual or straight, right? I don't have to worry about whether people have biases against LGBTQIA+ identifying individuals. And currently, I'm not economically disadvantaged at all. So I walk into a space and I have a lot of privilege. And I have to remember that, because when I say things, it has impact on other people who may not have these same privileges. And I know it's really hard for people, but it's really important to know your privilege. And again, as I already said, is try not to make it about all the ways that you are marginalized, right? And that's what often we all want to do. All right, so we're going to take a moment and we're going to focus on this bias against women in science. And the reason I say that we're going to focus on is we have the most data. One, it's easy to calculate because we know the percentage of women that are in the population and what the matrices should be. Most nations have been sort of at least loosely tracking this for a long time, maybe not in science specifically, but sort of in the workforce. And we know that it's an everyone issue. Every single person in this room knows a woman. There are identities you may have never met, so it's hard for you to, sort of sympathize or empathize. And hopefully every single person in this room at least knows and loves or at least likes at least one woman they've met in their life. So you would want them to succeed. All right, so one of the things we know is, again, that these ideas of unconscious and implicit bias creep in, that we know that both men and women can be biased against women. And this is not because we're intentional. We've been socially sort of taught what are people's roles in society. We also know that women are more likely to be subjected to inappropriate sexual and comments and advances. And since women are lost at every level, we already saw this analogy of the leaky pipeline. We know we all have to do work to both encourage and retain them. So I'm going to show you some data from the United States. We've been documenting a lot of these things for a long time. So we have a lot of data, and every 2 years they're updated. So within the total jobs within STEM, so all the science, technology, engineering, mathematics jobs, all the jobs in the whole United States, if we look at the percentage of men and women occupying, we're almost at parity, right? But if we look within STEM jobs, what we see is suddenly women are super underrepresented. So clearly something is happening that is either suggesting to women you don't belong here, or they're being actively excluded. There has been an update. So since 2021, they've published some more data. We have increased. We're now at 35%. We're still far below parity. Now, if we look at this is gender again, but looking across a broader number of years. And the reason I like this is that it sort of shows how quickly we're advancing, which isn't very quickly at all. And here's the other thing. Even when we do finally get hired into the same job as our male colleagues, the same pay, in theory, the same grade, we're asked to do the same tools, the same jobs, we get paid about 84 cents on the dollar. So even women's value is underappreciated within both all jobs and in non-STEM jobs. Now, the good news is if you work in STEM, you get paid more, but this still should be equal, right? If we're doing equal jobs, we should get equal pay. It has been updated and women are doing much better recently. We're making almost as much as men, but the fact is that we should always be equal, making equal. Now, if we look at the number or the percentage of women who are in university faculty jobs across different fields, in this case, what we're looking at is the non-tenured faculty. What you'll notice is some fields are doing much better than others, right? So if you're in the biological, agricultural, environmental sciences, we're near over 40% are women represented in those fields. Some of our related fields are doing quite miserably. But once you move into those tenured faculty, suddenly all the fields are doing terribly. Right? And so this suggests that, again, we're seeing that pipeline, those leaks or those sieves are still playing out. So this is a really interesting study. Our major funding agency in the United States for basic research is called the National Science Foundation. Well, the National Science Foundation decided that they needed to do a self-study. Were they biased in who they were giving money to? And did it change across rank as people went from, assistant professor to then being tenured associate professors to eventually being full? And they give out money across 5 different kinds of science, from geology to biology to, those kinds of things. And what they said is, before we can even figure out if we're biased in who we're giving money to, we need to know what's the playing field, like who's in those fields. And so what you're looking at is the number of individuals that are either men, which are the blue diamonds, or women are the red triangles. And then they said, okay, at each of these fields, what is a representation of men versus women? And what you'll notice is that all of them do better at the assistant levels, and all of them do terribly by the time you get to be a full professor. Some of them are doing better for a longer period of time, right? Before we see that divergence. Some are starting already, even at the assistant level, highly biased. So I tried to look around for some data from Mexico. It's not as easy to access for me. I don't speak Spanish, which is really, I will admit, I'm incredibly embarrassed about. But when I could find data, you're not in much better shape. So this is, and I put citations along the bottom. So if anybody wants these slides later, you can look them up. I'll read the part in yellow. It says, Mexico has one of the greatest gender gaps among the OECD, with only 8% of women choosing to work in STEM careers, compared to 27% of men. So this is like asking, when people enter the workforce, where are they choosing to go? Now, only 27% of men are agreeing, wanting to work in these fields, but still we're pretty abysmal with the number of women. So this is the labor force participation rate in Mexico. Well, it's actually not in Mexico. It's across a whole bunch of different countries. And what you can see is that the percentage of females in the population above the age of 15 that are employed is really low, and Mexico is among the lowest. So what we're seeing is that women are not working anywhere. So this is telling us something about how our cultures are influencing even our thoughts about women's roles in the workforce. And if we look at the gender gap, so this is looking at the percentage of women and what their pay is, what we see is there was an increase in around 1994. There was something that happened majorly in your economic society that took a big dip, and women really dropped out of the workforce, but they've really never recovered, and they've actually continued to go down in their pay rate. So it suggests that we're seeing exactly the same things, that women are not employed and they're paid less. So what do we know about the biases against women in STEM fields? There's actually an impressive body of literature around this. If this is something that gets you excited, start diving into the scientific literature. That's how I got into this. I was just like, I'm a scientist. I can interpret scientific papers. I started reading as many as I could. We know that most people often associate science and math fields with being quote unquote male or having more male characteristics, and humanities and arts with being female, right? That's that sort of cultural component. We know that women in these quote unquote male jobs are viewed as less competent and then their male peers. That when women are clearly competent, they're considered less likable. You know all the words that they use. I won't even use most of them, but often bossy comes up. I've been told I'm bossy several times in my life. I guarantee you that every time I've been told I'm bossy, it's by an older white man. And you know what I tell them now? Because I'm a full professor. I'm not bossy, I'm the boss. I do. I don't have anything to lose now, but I will tell you early in my career, that hurt me. I started saying, maybe I should step back. Maybe I shouldn't be as vocal. Maybe I shouldn't be as proud of my research. No, that if they can do it, why can't I? All right. We also know that people are less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments. There's many ways in which this plays out. You've seen it. You're sitting around a table and a woman says, wait, I know how we can solve this. And they say something and then somebody just ignores it. And then 2 seconds later, a guy says exactly the same thing. And they're like, oh, Mark, you're absolutely right. And we also know that on average, people are less likely to hire a woman with identical credentials than a man. So really what I hope that you've taken away is that this is a major issue, but it's not just a women's only issue. And that's really what I want us to start to talk about. I know that it's easy to talk about gender parity or gender equity. It should be gender equality. But there are lots of other identities that are being excluded from these conversations if we stop there. I will say there's a lot less data. But look, this is again from the United States, and we're looking at the number of people that are employed in STEM fields based on their ethnicity and their gender. And of course, what you can see right away is white men are overrepresented as being employed in STEM jobs. Oh, this is the beauty. So I started doing this work when I was just started in my PhD, talking about women in science issues. And the number of times I got told, well, Corey, we've just started talking about this in the last 10 years. Just give it time. I graduated in 2007. We're still talking about it and I haven't seen much change. And the reason I bring this up is everybody kept saying, well, just give it time. Time will fix it. All right, so let's fast forward almost 10 years. And what we see is that men have gone down, white men have gone down 6%. White women have had no change. And we've seen super incremental changes across most other axes of identities. And most have had no change at all. So, okay, well, you know, how much longer do we have to wait? So clearly whatever we've been doing the last 10 years, and this is 2015, is not working. There are lots of other identities that get excluded from participating in science and even in society. So this is data from first-generation college students. So this means their parents didn't go to college. And what we see is their ability to excel in undergraduate degrees is incredibly biased by the fact they don't have somebody at home to tell them how to do it, that they don't have somebody at home that says, oh, I'll help you study that. Or let me tell you how I overcame that. Or go talk to your teachers, go to office hours, see a tutor. They don't have anyone to tell them that. And, you know, that's true. I was a first generation student. There were programs to try to help me. The thing I think that's so shocking about this paper to me is it's not just first generation students, second generation students, they do slightly better, but they're still not performing at the level of their colleagues who have had, you know, generations of educated individuals. So those programs that first time are not enough. If we look at those individuals that have disabilities, what we can see is that, this one's on minorities again, and it's by degree. So of course, the higher the degree you have, the less likely you are to be within STEM fields, right? That makes sense. There's just less of us. But if you look at the rate of change, it's actually really small, right? So if we look at the axes, for even undergraduates, we're starting at 10% in 1993, and we're only getting to 16% by 2017. And so this is really disheartening if we think about all the identities of underrepresented groups that are not making it into science. We also know that we're losing a large proportion of our LGBTQIA+ identifying individuals. And what's really interesting in this study is they said, all right, let's track individuals who've enrolled in college in STEM degrees. And then let's see what happens by the time they graduate. And what they found is in particular for men who identified as being gay, they were more likely to leave STEM. They weren't dropping out of college. They were just switching to a different degree. So it's not that they couldn't perform. There's something there that's telling them they don't belong. Now, what we're looking at here is 3 different years across 3 different identities. So the first set of data is for women, first from 1999, 2008, and then 2019. And then again, now we're looking for underrepresented individuals and those with disabilities. And what we can see is that although, yes, women are increasing through time, again, we're still under 40%. But if we look at those individuals that are underrepresented who have identities of ethnicity, we have a huge disparity in sort of what those numbers should be based on their percentage of the population within the United States, which is probably somewhere around 40%. Now, if we look at people with disabilities, they're almost not increasing at all. So really, we're excluding a whole community of individuals with brilliant brains because their bodies are not able. So sort of summarizing this, we know that those, stereotypes are still persisting. For women in male jobs, they're viewed as less competent. That when they're less competent, they're less likable, as we've already said. Women of color in the United States reported that they had to confront negative racial stereotypes. This should never happen while they're at a job in a STEM field. That Black women were more likely than any other group to say they had a sense of bleak isolation. They didn't feel like they had anyone to talk to. That Latinx and Black women often reported being mistaken for janitors and admins, even when they're full professors, and that men of color described similar experiences. That's where you sort of talk about the cultural biases we have, right? That Asian reported stereotypes such as being quote unquote forever foreign, meaning that people assume that English isn't their first language, even if their families have been in that country for numerous generations. And that women and people of color are often held to higher standards of dress than their male colleagues. Any of you who've been to an evolution or an ecology conference know that most of the senior white men show up in flip-flops with socks, t-shirts with holes, and shorts, where most of the people of color and women are sort of held to a different level of dress to be considered peers. And so we have to think about what influence that has on the psyche, the amount of energy and time we're asking those individuals to dedicate to things about thinking what they wear. All right, so I'm going to walk you through a few examples of where we actually see this play out. So this was a beautiful study. It was done by some biologists. What they said is, we think there's bias in our fields. So what they did is they created these CVs, identical CVs. They gave one the first name John, one first name Jennifer, and then they contacted a whole bunch of their colleagues across lots of universities in the US and just said, hey, look, my university has this weird thing. I want to hire a technician, but before I hire a technician, I just need you to evaluate them. Just tell me, how likely are you to hire them? What would you pay them? Would you give them professional development? They didn't send them both. They just sent them either John or Jennifer's, hundreds and hundreds of them, and then sent them back. And probably not surprisingly, since this is what we're here for, what they found is that they were more likely to hire the male. They were more likely to give the male a higher pay, hourly pay, and they were more likely to give them professional development opportunities. Now, this is ridiculous. It's the identical CV. And what's even worse is that men and women were both equally likely to show this bias. Now, this is across gender. We also know it's true across race. So in the business world, they've been actually assessing this for a lot longer and much more thoroughly than us. And that's because to them, all it is the bottom dollar. They don't care what it takes to get to the money. That's what they want. So they've been studying this for a long time. So in this case, they put up 4 different resumes with just different first names. We have Greg and Emily, we have Lakeisha and Jamal. So you can make assumptions about what their ethnic identities are, and then put them up on major job boards in major cities, and then saw how many times were they clicked, how many times were they contacted to look at their CV, how many times were they contacted for an interview. Not surprisingly, Greg and Emily were far more likely to be contacted for job positions. Same resume. So as I've already mentioned, we have this idea that we just have to wait, right? So in this case, if we sort of look at where we are, just looking at the number of men and women positions, we can see across all identities, men are holding 74% of all these positions in STEM jobs in 2006. It's decreased to not only 71% in 2015. But at this rate, it's going to take 90 years just to reach gender parity. We're not even talking about all the other identities that we're losing from the system. All right, so let's talk about some solutions. Let me talk about why we all have to do this work. You could imagine that I could sit up here and say, let's fight for gender parity, and I could leave it at that. As a woman, right, I can see that my colleagues that are women are often excluded. But it's my job to say, I have those identities of privilege. I have to stand up here and fight that everyone has this equal seat at the table. So that's why I'm going to say, men in the room, you got to fight for women to have parity. White people, you got to fight for people of color. People with no disabilities need to fight for people with disabilities. If you're a cis heterosexual person, fight for your LGBTQI identifying individuals. It's all of our jobs. So one of the things we know, and this is something that I kind of get aggravated with the academy, is that people say there's not enough jobs for all the PhD candidates. Yeah, if they all want to go into the academy. And yes, I know us professors like to think that all of our students just want to be us. They don't. We know there's not enough trained PhDs. And I looked this data up in both the US and in Mexico to fill all the trained labor that is needed within each of those countries. We need PhD students going out to fill those jobs. So this idea that there's not enough, positions, that's wrong. So we need to keep training individuals. We know that when you have diverse teams, we have increased innovation, increased creativity, and increased problem solving. We know that when you have diverse teams, you have increased teamwork, but you're also more likely to attract and retain the best talent. And that we know that this diverse workforce across all identities is critical in order to sort of harness the power of science. So you don't have to believe me. I'm going to show you some data that tells you that it's true. So this was a study in which the authors went through and assessed hundreds of thousands of publications, sorted by author first names across lots of languages, and just said, what's the probability that an author list is all male versus gender heterogeneous? Turns out there's not a lot of just only female biased papers. So they couldn't use that data because the sample size was too low. And then they said, what's the probability they get cited? What's their longevity in the literature? And what they showed is across the board, when you had gender heterogeneous teams, it had a higher impact in science. We know that it's also true for ethnic diversity. It's where you can see another place where you have increased scientific impact. And when you have these, this is really interesting, because if you get a group of diverse problem solvers who all think in different ways, come from different backgrounds, give them a problem, they can outperform a group of already identified high problem solvers, right? Because when you're bringing different ways of looking at a problem together, you're more likely to get to innovative solutions. If you want to see more examples in science, there's a great blog. If you want to see more examples, period, just go to the business literature. It is filled with this stuff. All right, so this you might ask, well, why is this in a solution? It's yet again pointing out a problem, and I'll show you in a minute. So what we see is that across the board, women are less likely to receive scholarly prizes. It's true across every field, and it's true even more based on where you are in your career trajectory. But the reason that this isn't a solution is that we all can be nominating deserving women and other underrepresented identities for these awards. And the reason I put this as a solution is that the data already shows us that white men are far more likely to self-nominate. They're also far more likely to ask someone to nominate them. Think about that. So one, women, start asking people to nominate you for stuff, other identities too. Also, please start asking people to do it. Secondly, those of you in positions of power, start thinking about who you haven't been nominating for these prizes. The other thing is I want to talk about who's actually doing the work. Not only just the DEI work, that could be gender parity, it could be, LGBTQIA plus access, it could be people with disabilities being able to be part of the conversation. What we know is that underrepresented faculty play a disproportionate role in advancing these issues. And it's not just around things about equity and inclusion. It's often almost every other service role in your institution, whether it's setting up the coffee pot, whether it's taking notes at the faculty meeting, whether it's organizing. Think about who's doing the work. Start paying attention. And when you start noticing the biases, it's those of you who realize like, oh shoot, I've been volunteering a lot. Stop volunteering. Let someone else step up. And for those of you who have not been stepping up, it's your turn. Because what we know is that every time somebody's doing a service role, it means it's taking away from their scholarly work. So what are the barriers that are preventing people from being successful in STEM that hold these identities? One, we know there's a lack of role models, right? Two, we know there's a lack of publicity aimed at women in these roles. Go through textbooks. There's actually a study that was done recently that went through the top, 5 biology textbooks and literally just counted every time that a woman or a man was represented and then what their perceived identity of as far as ethnicity was. And it's something like 95% are white men. When there's a woman, they're usually in a subservient role. They're sitting at a desk and a man standing over them. And in most of the cases, the only time a person of color was represented was when it was talking about a crisis, like what's caused because of a massive war. AIDS epidemics. So those are signals that are being sent to all of us all the time. It's telling us who should be haves and who should be have-nots, right? So think again about when we see, publicity happening. Again, this idea of a perceived lack of job opportunities, the fact that people in these roles often have these, senses of isolation and lack of support. We often have this lack of flexibility in part-time working. We're having this seminar at 4. People who have kids can't be here, or they're doing some kind of a juggling thing, trying to figure out who's taking care of who, right? We have to think about these things. When do we do things in the evening? When do we do them on a Saturday? When do we do them too early in the morning, right? Think about that flexibility. We have, at least in the United States, you guys have a different set. We have white male-dominated culture. You guys have a different kind of male-dominated culture. And some people say it's the same, some people say it's brown, but it doesn't matter, right? We know that the sort of culture is like defined by one group. We know that a lot of these individuals suffer from imposter syndrome, right? They've been told from every port of their society that they don't really belong there. And it gets reinforced every time they come to work. We have a lack of mentors for these individuals. Keep in mind that people who have historically marginalized identities often also feel, that the lack of mentors means that they don't have anybody to turn to except a few individuals. So again, talking about service, even if you don't see the service that your female, your LGBTQIA plus faculty, your faculty with disabilities, they're doing way more unseen labor, because every one of your students, every time something goes wrong, is in their office or topping them after class. You may not know it. They can't put it on their CVs. It's happening. And that's that idea of the uneven service burdens. But the great news is that every single one of these is super easily fixable, right? So think about what each of us can do, both individually, as a department, as a unit, as an institution, as a society, to sort of change every one of these. So how do we actually solve them? There's sort of 3 concrete ways. One, of course, policy. That's the most important thing, right? Because once something is enacted in policy, then there's really no way to go against it. So start thinking about how, as a department, as a lab, what are your policies? As your institution, as your society, as your government, start advocating for those situations in which you can use that policy to limit bias effects. Each of us has to acknowledge and actually do the work to understand our own biases and try to change them, right? And lastly, we have to reduce the impact of others. And so we're going to talk in a moment about how to be an active bystander. So how do we solve these problems as individuals and as organizations? As an individual, you can do this thing called priming, and it sounds so simple and weird. It's this idea that you consciously prime yourself about, you have to know what your biases are. And before you go into any decision making, so whether you're going to serve on a committee that's going to hire somebody, whether you're going to interview somebody, whether you're going to be on a board of the institution, remember, I have biases. Oh yeah, this is my bias. And then prime yourself. And it's a simple exercise where you say, okay, I'm biased against blank. Let's say I'm biased against white men. And I'm going to be like, because they're all freaking Donald Trumps. And then I'm like, well, that's not actually true. Some of them are pretty awesome. Bill Nye the Science Guy, I like that guy. Doing just that exercise can last anywhere from hours to months on my decision making, right? So that's why you have to know what your biases are. We need to reorganize the structures and systems, right? So this comes down to where we can make structural changes. And those structural changes don't have to be like, well, the university isn't doing anything. Well, what is your lab doing? What is your department doing, right? So you can start where you actually have impact, and hopefully it can ripple up. And we need new forms of accountability, right? We can't just point out problems. We need to say, what are we going to do about them? And how are we going to measure success? And what are we going to do if our success isn't being made? All of us should be working to be an ally at all times. And I know it sounds so easy. So an ally is someone from a non-marginalized group who uses their privilege to advocate for a marginalized group. What's happening is you're transferring your benefits or your privilege to those who lack it. You can only be an ally through action. So remember, it's a verb, not a noun. You can't have an ally button. You actually have to do the work. There is something called performative allyship. And this is the idea that, on the other hand, when someone has that same non-marginalized identity and they profess support, like, oh, I'm totally behind this group, but in a way is either not helpful or actively harms that group. It usually involves the ally getting some kind of reward or a pat on the back. They look like the good guy, right? So check yourself. Remember, ask yourself, why are you feeling like the ally? What is the action you're doing? Is it to make yourself feel better? If no one could know you were doing it, would you still do it, right? I love these 5 tips from Franchesca Ramsey about being an ally. First, understand your privilege. It doesn't mean you're rich. It doesn't mean you've had an easy life. It doesn't mean you've never had to work hard. There's just some things in your life you will never experience or have to think about because of who you are. There's a sports star in the UK. He's a Black man who played basketball in the UK, and he has this podcast. It's very popular with people who like sports. Every now and then he'll go on some other topic. And he had gone on once every month, he'll go on something related to equity and inclusion. And I listened to the beginning of one because a friend had sent it to me. And he was talking about how he'll never understand what it's to be a woman. No surprise. He's like a 7-foot tall Black man. He'll never know what it's like to be a woman. But he said that when it finally struck him, there was like this thing that happened on Twitter where somebody had started it and it became viral, where they just asked if all the men were to disappear from the earth for just 12 hours and then come back like they knew nothing, what would you do in that 12 hours? And he said he was struck by how mundane the things were. Women were saying, I would just run with both ear pods in. I'd go for my evening run. I would run at night. Like, it was so shocking to him that he's never thought about, like, I wouldn't walk with my car keys clenched in my hand every time I'm outside at night. Like, things that he's just never thought about. And so I think that's the thing. Like, there's some things you'll never know what it's like to have that identity. You have to listen into your homework. And it's real easy to say, oh, I don't know what it's like to be a Black man. Hey, what's it like to be a Black man? Tell me, is it hard? No. It's my job to do the homework. I have internet. I can go and look at all the ways they're discriminated against, both obvious and hidden, right? I can do my homework. That is my job. Don't put the work on others. Speak up and not over. All of us have that. We want to, you shouldn't do that to so-and-so. Well, wait, no. That you should only talk for yourself, not over somebody else. You're going to make mistakes, and trust me, it sucks when you do. But to do this work, you're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. There are nights I can't sleep because I'm like, fuck that thing up again. I used the wrong pronouns. I made a mistake by using that set of words. But guess what? I have to get up, I have to do my homework, and I have to get back out there and do it again. So when you make a mistake, you have to remember you have to apologize. And this is the thing that's so hard. It's about your impact, not your intent. That one is so hard. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I feel like such a jerk. That doesn't matter. Just say, I am so sorry. I will do my homework. That's it. Because it's now on me, not on them. Their job is not to make me feel better. I just hurt them, right? So think about it's your impact, not your intent. And again, ally is a verb. You have to keep doing the work every day. You never get to go, ally, done. Oops, sorry. I don't know what button I hit there. And again, this is something that's really in the academy. I think people don't realize how obvious it is. Sometimes it's just showing up. And what I mean by that is if one of your female colleagues is getting an award, go sit in the audience. If one of your students is getting an award, go sit in the audience. I know you're like, I got a freaking million things to do, but show that you're supporting their accolades. Show that you're supporting their achievements, right? Because often if it's somebody who's like a leader in your field, you're there, but you have to be there when it's not just the leaders. All right, so let's talk for a moment about being an active bystander. I'm sorry, I'm going to do a time check because I get really excited. Okay. This is really important. So a bystander is a person who often observes a conflict or unacceptable behavior. We've all been there. And it might seem something serious or minor, a one-time thing or repeated, but the bystander knows the behavior is destructive and likely to make a bad situation worse. Where an active bystander actually takes steps to make sure that you can make a difference. So remember, this is hard. If it's unwanted, it's harassment. And I know if for some reason we've got it wrapped up in our mind that harassment only equals sexual harassment. No, harassment is bullying. Harassment is microaggressions. That is all harassment. And it can be done by anybody to anybody. Harassment is always defined by the point of the target, not the victim. Right? I didn't choose, like, it's not like something happened to me. Somebody did something to me. I'm the target of the harassment. And when I say that, what I mean is oh, they didn't mean to do it. It doesn't matter. They hurt that person. That's what matters. And the intent, again, is not important. So how do you actually act like a active bystander? So there's trainings. If you ever get an opportunity to do one with an actual facilitator, definitely do it. They're super uncomfortable, but they're really helpful. It's like exercising that muscle you didn't know you have. And then you're just like, I didn't even know I had that thing and it's all sore. That's what you have to do. So there's strategies for in the moment and there's strategies for after the fact. So in the moment, you can name or acknowledge the offense. Again, talk from your own place, not about the view of the targets. You can interrupt a behavior. You can publicly support the person, or you can remove the target or harasser from the situation. So let's go through some examples that I'm sure we've all seen. We're at a scientific conference, we're standing around chit-chatting and, waiting at the posters, and there's a group that are congregating, and then somebody starts to tell a joke and you know where this joke is going. You can go, excuse me, Dr. So-and-so, I know where that joke's going. I find it offensive. Even if I'm not the target of the joke, maybe I have the identity that's going to benefit in this joke, right? And even if I know that, oh my gosh, he's talking about that person right there, it doesn't matter. I find that offensive. I'm going to ask you to stop right there. Let's talk about another example. You're at the same poster session, everybody's having a couple beers, you're sitting talking to your friends and you look over and there's someone who's clearly like, a trainee trying to show a poster. They're pointing at their figures and, the senior guy with too many drinks is like leaning on them and touching them and they're kind of wincing away every time. And I don't even know either of these people, but I can walk over and I can say, hey, I'm doing a poster too. Come with me right now to the bathroom. Just pull them away, right? Give them a moment to regroup, to figure out what's going on. If you know them, maybe it's a senior person in your field that you've read their papers, you've never spoken to, but I could walk up and go, hey, Dr. So-and-so, I'm sorry to interrupt you right now, but I really want to talk about your last paper. Just break up the situation for a moment. That's being an active bystander. Now, after the fact, you can report the incident. You can do it with or without names. You can encourage the person. You can go with them to report it. Even if they don't report it, you can report it without sharing any details so that people's eyes are on. They're watching a little more closely, right? You can talk privately with the harasser. Let's imagine it's the person telling the joke and you're like, I know they had no idea that was going to be bad. Just pull them aside. If you think it's a one-time thing, tell them because they're going to want to know. They're going to want to go do their homework. You can also talk privately with the target. Now, sometimes that that's a serial harasser. Talking to them is not going to do a bit of good. Go report, right? Also, this is a really important one. You should all be members of diversity and science groups. If you're a man, you should belong to a women in science group. They need your membership dollars to run all their programming. If you don't have a marginalized identity, join a marginalized identity group. This is the best story ever. Some of you in this room know Tracy Heath. She's an amazing systemicist. Very good friend of mine. We've been friends since graduate school. Fast forward years later, I'm in a faculty position my first year. She's like, hey, Corey, you should come to SOCNIS. Now, SOCNIS is an organization that's specifically towards minoritized individuals in science. It stands for the Science for the Society of Chicanos and Hispanics and Indigenous People in STEM. I don't know why I'm fumbling that right now. And she's like, hey, you should come to the SOCNIS conference. And I went, Tracy, I don't hold any of those identities. And despite the fact I've been doing all this work for LGBTQIA individuals and for women in science for years, right? And she looks at me and she goes, they want allies there too, dummy. And that dummy stuck in my head. And to this day it does, right? Every time I question something, I'm like, dummy. And I went out the next day and I bought a lifetime membership to SOCNIS and I go every year I possibly can, right? Because I have trainees who have those identities. I need to know how to become a better mentor. I need how to give them opportunity. I need to show that I'm willing to do the work. So I'm going to encourage all of you to do the work. All right. So just last thing, I want to remind everyone that, we have to support policy changes. We have to actually do the work there. We have to be aware of our own biases. We have to do the work to limit our own biases. Remember, you can prime yourself. We need to encourage and support those individuals that have those minoritized identities. We need to have role models and mentors for those individuals. We know how important they are. We need to find one or we need to be one. We need to nominate women and other underrepresented scientists for all the awards and not just the teaching awards, not just the mentoring awards, not just the diversity awards, for scholarly awards. We need to ensure that when possible, we have diversity on all admissions and decision-making committees. If not, make sure you have someone who is an ally on those committees, right? So they can be holding people accountable. Empower them when you give them that role. And everyone should, of course, join one of these diversity and science groups. And I just want to remind you that being an ally is an action and not an identity. And with that, that's all I have. And I will stick around if people have questions, but thanks.
Gracias. Hi, Corey. So recently in the US, I don't know if affirmative action was struck down. Is it that not in every state, I guess?
No, so the idea is that we can no longer use race or ethnicity in admissions to universities and to graduate programs, but affirmative action for hiring still stands.
Okay, good. So do you think that that will be something that one can implement in a hiring process? Sort of this position is aimed to increase diversity in gender. This position is aimed to increase diversity in, something else, because there is a lot of the slogan of the best CV should get the position, right? Yeah. But that perpetuates, we know who is going to get the position.
Yeah. So I think it comes back to that idea of equity, not equality, right? So when I look at CVs and I'm like, okay, this person went to this university where I know they don't even have a sequencing machine. The students, often may not even be home secure. And I see someone who excelled there. That tells me other qualities that I want in a graduate student or I want in a colleague, right? So you have to start thinking about what are the other matrices that are important to you and not just a 4.0 grade average or whatever their H index is, right? And so that's one of the things that we've implemented in all of our searches, both for faculty and for undergraduates, where it's not crossing the law. They call it distance traveled. It's such a stupid name. It doesn't mean like, how far did you move? It means how far have you had to, what barriers have you overcome? What are the things that not just you, but maybe everyone who holds your identity has had to overcome in order to be successful? And we need to consider that as we're making those measures. The other thing I'll say is that recruitment is still a very powerful way to attract people. We actually know from all of our university data, we've been gathering at Cornell for a long time, that having individual reach outs for faculty positions or having programs that go into disadvantaged high schools and asking them to apply increases the rate of people that even apply so that we can pick those great individuals. The last thing I was going to say about that is, I had one more thing. It might have skipped me for now. I'll hopefully return to me.
I was recruited, and it's so important, as you said,
yes.
because sometimes these jobs openings, there is internet nowadays, but it's still, you just don't see it. And you are so busy as a postdoc, you just don't see it. Yeah.
Yes. The last thing I was going to say is we have found one way around it. So, yes, we can't say we want to hire 3 Black men in our department. That's completely against the law, right? But the way we've gone around it is we've said, we want to hire 5 faculty who work on issues related to science-based solutions to diversity, equity, inclusion. Anyone can apply. Any identity can get the job. And we did have people with lots of privilege get those jobs, but the work they do is to make our society and our institution better. And those are still people I want as my colleagues, right? And so you have to think about what are the clever workarounds.
Thank you for all the information. It's really helpful and great to see someone to care about this. So you give us a lot of great information to know how to really be an ally, not only as a noun. But you have more personal tips to not fall on that noun or not fall like a savior complex, because sometimes it's hard. It's pick up over it, but sometimes they just carry a savior complex that is very awkward and it's not okay.
It's true. And so I think, a lot of times, depending on career stage, depending on your identities, you may not be in a position where you get to be an ally that moment, or where you get to be an active bystander. But then that's when you sort of nudge the people who have those positions of power and say, hey, this thing just played out. I didn't feel that I had the ability to say something. Would you step in? right? And that's where those of us who are in positions of power, whatever kinds of power, whether it's our identities or our sort of, career level, it's our jobs to do the work. We might have to think creatively about how, because one of the things we know is as soon as you attack someone, the way that they respond is often not very logical. So sometimes to me, somebody comes to me and says, your colleague did this thing. And I'm like, okay, I know that person does never receive information well. So how I can't talk to them like I could talk to somebody else. So I have to think things through. But it's not always just your job to do the work. It's often leaning on other individuals to do it. You realize that all the senior people in the room, you're going to have a lot of people at your door now asking you to step into roles for them. Yes. Hi, Gabby. We live in a very multicultural, and it's been here forever. So I've been thinking, how do we change the mind of the young girls? I mean, it has to start in their youth, right? Yep. Is there a program? Is there anything Is there anything you can suggest to actually for other reps that where we can reach out? Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, so I think having these kinds of discussions is helpful. I actually teach a course on exactly this. I am not an expert. I have never taken any PhD classes or this is all just passion. I went and read as much literature as I could. This talk started because I kept having conversations with colleagues who were like, but I don't see a problem. And I'm like, there is a problem. And they're like, they're like, oh yeah, that one student told me once. And I'm like, trust me, if that one student told you once, there are thousands behind them. And scientists respond to data. That's why I started putting this talk together, because it's hard to fight data if you're a scientist. Now that led to me teaching a course, which led to me writing a paper on how to teach a course exactly like this. So this is a class that I teach for undergraduates and graduate students who want to join the class, specifically because I want them to see what's happening so they can start making that change. I will tell you, the younger generations are ready to make the change. It's already easier for them. You've already seen it. I remember in one of my classes I was teaching, I think I shared this story already. There was a discussion happening about something. We'd read a paper. And one of them's like, yeah, exactly, blah, 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 and got all riled up about something. And someone else is like, I'm going to follow up. Natalia, when you said that, she said, oh, Natalia, sorry, do you use she, her, he, him, or they, them pronouns? Oh, she, her. Anyway, so as Natalia said, she did blah, 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 and just didn't even skip a beat. Didn't know this person, had never met them in their life. They are just much more malleable. They're much more used to the change in society. This is what we should be capitalizing on so that the next generation, a lot of this goes away. So I would say it's all of our choices. We can implement in every single class we teach. Think about your PowerPoint slides. Who are the people portrayed in the PowerPoint slides? How are we presenting the material? I've had to redo this. I teach phylogenetics, and I got held accountable recently because I start with like, oh, Linnaean thought of literature and, this hierarchy. And one of my students in my class who was Indigenous was like, well, what did Indigenous people think about this before? And I was like, I don't know. So guess what? It was my home. I told them I will come back to you. So I went and talked to a bunch of my colleagues who are my peers, not students, and said, hey, I got asked this. What do you know? And after talking, I was like, oh, because Indigenous people never considered themselves outside of the natural world. So there was no hierarchy. So I had to share this with my students, and now it's incorporated into my class, right? So I have to think about, even though I thought I teach phylogenetics, where would I have to include DEI and phylogenetics? Wait, every picture I ever show in all my classes are all white men. Oh, except for Mutu Kimura. So guess what? I've started diversifying who I show in my class, what papers we read. I make sure that people of color, people that are women, people who are trans, they're the authors of the papers we're reading, right? And we talk about the authors too. I think we have to sort of stop pretending that science is this numbers and data thing. It's people. And how we present it has a huge impact. And I know that that's not super satisfying. You can create programs in your institutions, right? And so we have to think of all the strategies we can. Yeah, that's a great idea. No, I mean, a class would be great. Yeah, there's a paper on our website. You can download it. I'll send you a link with all the information. Kelly's actually teaching it now at UT Austin. Yeah, a lot of people started to implement it. Kelly Zamudio, as many of you know.
With the leaky analogy, what is it that it's called?
Leaky pipeline.
Leaky pipeline analogy. knowing that that has existed and we have seen it, all of us, I mean, we can see it here, what is the proportion of people that came here, right? And this is like an echo chamber. We all know these things. Do you think it's fair that nowadays some male colleagues ask for a 50-50 inclusion in some committees? So as an example, traditionally, I don't know, there is an event and the president of the event is a guy, and then the vice president is a guy too, but that has never been questioned. But now that we are talking about inclusion, equality, and all of that, there was an event and I nominated my girlfriend to be the president of the event. And I said, okay, I'll be the vice president. And a male colleague said, no. It has to be a guy. You know, it has to be president, female, vice president guy. I was like, but before they were both males and nobody said anything.
And this is where all the women should be standing up and saying it's not okay. And so should the men. This is where, as an ally, all of you guys should be standing up, right? Saying that is really uncool. We've all seen on Twitter and all the other social, the manels, right? So that's a panel of all men. But here's the other thing I would say is, well, where are your people of color? Where are your indigenous scholars? Where are your people with disabilities? Who's trans on that committee and on that workshop or on that panel, right? We have to hold all of ourselves accountable because here's the thing. We tend to get attracted to people who are like us. That is no surprise, you know, and I've inadvertently done it. I mean, I remember early in my career, we decided to buck the system. And at one of the evolution meetings, we said, in the major phylogenetics work symposia, we're going to do women in phylogenetics. We did have one man who's been a very vocal advocate for women speak, but everybody else was a woman. But we didn't think about all the other axes of identity, right? Mm-hmm. And so now I try to hold myself accountable because like I'll tend to fall in this, like, I love all the women in this room. Let's hang out together, right? Mm-hmm. We're great scientists, but I have to say, wait, who am I leaving behind? Mm-hmm. Who have I left not invited to the table?
Okay, thank you. I did feel it was unfair, but I was afraid that I was being too out there. You know, like once you see things, you cannot unsee them, but then you have to be careful to not see them everywhere.
Yes, that's true.
Right? So, thank you. Yeah.
I really see interesting that made a class for young women about this.
No, it's for everybody. Yeah. I have straight white heterosexual men who take my class. Good.
Yeah, but for the new generations, what you are saying, but I think the new generation are really questioning these things. So I think that this class and these questionings must be to the older people, because the new generation are saying these things, are fighting for these things, but if the older ones or with the most power ones doesn't do anything, so what can we do?
So I think there's many ways to think about it. So the way I think about it is everyone's on a spectrum to where they sort of have an understanding about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are those people that are echo chamber, right? We already all agree we're here because we already bought in and we volunteered. Then there's the people you will never, ever change their mind. Then there's everybody in between. I could easily spend 90% of my time on those people and I will make no difference. I ignore those people. Trust me, those people want to have arguments with me. I don't bother. It's going to do no good. I just try to pull a few of these people along further on the axis. That means I give this presentation in faculty meetings, in other departments, at other institutions where I go, right? Because I think you're absolutely right. We can't rely on just the next generation. Like that's again, like, oh, time's going to fix it. That's not true. And so we have to do the work. And that's where I say all of us have to hold our colleagues accountable too.
Si alguien tiene preguntas en español, las podemos hacer a la ponente. I think what was Andrea saying, unfortunately, there is still people in between us. I'm not saying all of us, but in the institute, for example, that are resistant to change the chip that we are going.
Yeah, and what you're going to see is, some of those people, once they start getting left behind and they realize like, oh shit, everybody else is kind of going this way, they're either going to dig their heels in more and try to yell more loudly. And the more you ignore them, it drives them crazy. That's okay. And then there's the people that as soon as they see like, oh shit, everybody's going that way and they're leaving me behind, I got to start doing my work. I'm going to try to learn a little, and they're super nervous about it. And here's the thing, they're going to make the most mistakes. Try to be gracious with them. If they're making mistakes because they are trying to be hurtful, hold them accountable. I have colleagues, senior colleagues who are really trying, and every time they open their mouth to the graduate students, they put their foot in their mouth, and the graduate students call them out every time. And on the one hand, that's right, but I've seen some of them start to close up and they don't want to engage. So I have to go over and try to and share with the students, like, you don't have to give up your beliefs, but for the people who are coming from such a different place of education, let's be a little gracious with them along the way. Now, there's a point at which I've been gracious with you for 3 years. I don't have to be gracious with you anymore, right? There is a point, but we're trying to educate everyone along the way. And so that's all of our jobs. You guys see who's not in the room. It's all of your jobs to see who's not in the room and go work on them. And I don't mean just the faculty. There are postdocs, there are graduate students that also need the work. Thank you so much for being with me. And I'm happy to talk more at any point while I'm here. And hopefully you can take it all with you. And I'll share the PowerPoint.